Good afternoon, ma'am. I just wanted to stop by and see how you were doing today.
It happened on a street most people no longer noticed, a place where time seemed to move forward without carrying everyone with it. The buildings were old, their walls marked by decades of weather and silence, and the pavement bore the quiet memory of countless footsteps that had long since disappeared. On a worn bench near the edge of the road sat an old woman, her posture small but steady, her hands folded carefully in her lap as if she were holding on to something invisible. She had been there for hours, watching the world pass without reacting to it, her eyes reflecting not curiosity but familiarity. Cars slowed and moved on, pedestrians passed without meeting her gaze, and the city continued its routine, unaware that history was sitting quietly in plain sight. When the police officer noticed her, it was not because she caused a disturbance or asked for help. It was because she did not move. Something about her stillness stood apart from the noise around her. The officer slowed his patrol car, unsure at first why his attention lingered, then stopped altogether, stepping out not with authority but with hesitation. He approached carefully, aware that age carries its own dignity and its own defenses. The woman looked up at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him, or perhaps someone like him, for a very long time. There was no fear in her expression, only recognition, as though she had seen this uniform before, in another era, under very different circumstances. When the officer spoke, his voice was calm, respectful, asking simple questions that required no urgency. The woman answered slowly, her words deliberate, shaped by years of careful restraint. She spoke not of why she was there, but of how the city had changed, of streets that once held parades, protests, and promises, of people who had believed deeply in service, duty, and sacrifice. As she talked, it became clear that she was not merely waiting for someone to arrive. She was waiting for something to be remembered. The officer listened, unaware that the reason he had stopped went far beyond concern or courtesy. The past was unfolding quietly between them, layered in her pauses, her measured tone, and the weight behind every word. What no one around them could see was that this meeting was not accidental. It was the convergence of two lives shaped by the same institution, separated by generations, bound by a story that had never been told out loud. And as the old woman continued to speak, the officer began to understand why stopping had felt unavoidable, because the reason she was there was not what anyone would have expected, and the truth she carried would soon change how he understood his badge, his duty, and the history he thought he already knew. The officer sat beside her, no longer aware of the passing traffic or the quiet stares of strangers who wondered why a patrol had stopped for someone who appeared harmless and ordinary. As the old woman continued, her voice carried a steadiness that only comes from someone who has lived long enough to stop fearing silence. She spoke of a time when the city was younger, when uniforms meant something different, when police officers walked the streets on foot and knew every family by name. She described a man she once knew, a young officer who wore his badge with pride but carried its weight with humility, someone who believed service was not about control, but about protection. The officer listening felt an unease he could not explain, as though the story was slowly turning toward him. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she recalled a winter decades earlier, a night of unrest and confusion, when fear moved faster than truth and decisions were made too quickly. She spoke of a moment when that young officer had stepped forward, not to enforce an order, but to shield someone who could not protect themselves. The cost of that choice, she said quietly, was greater than anyone ever acknowledged. Careers ended, names were erased, and sacrifices were folded into official silence. The city moved on, as cities always do, but she never did. She returned to this bench every year, on the same day, not to mourn publicly, but to remember privately. When the officer finally asked why she was telling him this now, she looked at his badge, then at his face, studying him with care. She told him she recognized the way he had approached her, the hesitation, the respect, the instinct to listen instead of command. It was the same instinct that man had once shown. Only then did she reveal the truth she had been carrying for decades. The officer she spoke of was not just a story from the past. He was family. And the reason she waited was not for apology, recognition, or justice. She waited to see if the values she had once believed in still existed in someone wearing the same uniform. As her words settled, the officer understood why stopping had felt inevitable. This was not a random encounter. It was a quiet test of continuity, a question asked across generations, and the answer was unfolding not through policy or procedure, but through the simple act of listening. The air between them felt heavier after her words settled, as if the city itself had paused to listen. The officer no longer saw the old woman as someone waiting on a bench. He saw her as a living archive, carrying a chapter of history that had never been written down. She continued, explaining how that young officer had stood alone when it mattered most, how the uniform he wore had not protected him from consequences, and how the truth had been buried beneath reports that favored order over justice. She spoke without anger, without accusation, only with the clarity of someone who had outlived the need for validation. The officer felt an unfamiliar conflict rising inside him, a tension between the ideals that had drawn him to the badge and the reality of what institutions sometimes chose to forget. He realized that everything she was describing existed in fragments within training manuals and speeches, but never in full honesty. As she talked, she pointed out small details around them, buildings that once housed community centers, streets where officers and residents had stood side by side during moments of crisis, places where trust had been built and later eroded. This was not nostalgia, it was context. She was explaining how the present had been shaped by unacknowledged choices of the past. The officer understood then that her waiting was not passive. It was deliberate. Each year she returned not because she believed someone would finally apologize, but because remembrance itself was an act of resistance against erasure. When she looked at him again, her expression softened slightly. She told him she did not expect him to fix what had been broken long before he was born. What she wanted was simpler and heavier at the same time, proof that the values her family had once believed in had not disappeared entirely. The officer felt the weight of that expectation, not as pressure, but as responsibility. He realized that the reason no one expected why he stopped was because most people no longer believed history could still speak. Yet here it was, asking quietly whether the present was willing to listen. Part 4, Dramatic plus Historical Depth, Paragraph, Narration ready. The officer remained seated long after the old woman stopped speaking, aware that standing up too quickly would break something fragile that had formed between them. He looked again at his badge, not with pride or doubt, but with a new awareness of how much history could be carried by something so small. The woman told him how silence had shaped her life, how years of unanswered questions had taught her to expect nothing from institutions that preferred closure to truth. She described how the family learned to live without recognition, how memories were passed down quietly, stripped of bitterness but never of meaning. As she spoke, the officer realized that the history she carried was not meant to accuse him personally, nor to burden him with guilt for decisions made long before his time. It was meant to place him within a continuum, to remind him that every action taken in uniform added a line to a story that would outlast him. She explained that she had watched generations of officers pass through the city, some hurried, some hardened, some indifferent, and a few who still carried themselves with restraint and empathy. Those were the ones she watched most closely, not to judge them, but to see whether the spirit she remembered had survived beneath layers of policy and pressure. The officer felt a quiet shift within himself, a recognition that accountability did not always come from oversight or discipline, but from remembering who came before and why they had chosen to serve. He understood that her presence on that bench each year was not an act of mourning alone, but of guardianship, protecting a version of history that could easily vanish if no one stopped to hear it. Around them, the city resumed its rhythm, unaware that a bridge had been formed between eras, not through ceremony or confrontation, but through attention and humility. The officer finally spoke, not to defend his profession or promise change, but to acknowledge the truth of what she had shared. In doing so, he accepted something heavier than blame and more enduring than praise, the responsibility to carry that memory forward in how he conducted himself, how he treated others, and how he understood the power entrusted to him. In that moment, the old woman did not smile, nor did she thank him. She simply nodded, as if confirming that the answer she had been waiting for was not spoken, but shown. Final part, dramatic, historical, paragraph, narration ready. When the officer finally rose to leave, the moment did not feel like an ending, but like the closing of a circle that had been left open for decades. The old woman remained seated on the bench, her posture unchanged, yet something in her expression suggested a quiet release, not relief, but completion. She had not come seeking justice in the formal sense, nor recognition that could be framed or announced. What she had waited for was continuity, proof that the values once carried by a man she loved had not been entirely lost to time. The officer walked back toward his patrol car with a different weight than the one he carried when he arrived, not heavier in burden, but deeper in purpose. He understood that history did not demand apology from him, nor did it ask for grand gestures. It asked for presence, for restraint, for choices made with awareness of what they would echo into the future. As he drove away, the city appeared unchanged, the same streets, the same noise, the same indifference. Yet beneath that surface, something had shifted. A story that had lived quietly in one woman's memory had been acknowledged, not recorded, not corrected, but honored through attention. The old woman remained where she was, watching the traffic move, knowing she would return again if needed, not out of habit, but out of trust that someone, someday, would still stop. The officer, now carrying a piece of history he had not inherited by birth but by choice, continued his patrol with a renewed understanding of his role. He knew that long after his shift ended, long after his name was forgotten, what would matter was how he chose to listen when history spoke softly. And that was the reason no one expected, the reason he stopped, not because of policy, suspicion, or duty, but because the past had reached forward, quietly, and he had answered.